Alan and Sean here from the Prancing Pony Podcast, welcoming you to the Tolkien Experience Podcast.
The Tolkien Experience Podcast is an attempt to bring the fan and scholarly communities together around our shared passion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Each episode features a notable scholar or member of the fan community sharing their Tolkien experience.
And now we'll send you over to Sarah and Luke.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Luke Shelton.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Every other week, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any further delay, let me introduce our guest. This week's episode of the Tolkien Experience Podcast brings you a very special first part of a 2-part interview with Corey Olsen. Corey is the president of Signum University and a prolific Tolkien podcaster, spending multiple hours each week talking about Tolkien with a lot of his fans, friends, and followers. His podcasts include Exploring Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion Film Project, and Mythgard Academy. He'll give you more information about those at the end of our interview. But for now, let me also mention his book, Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. It's a wonderful and helpful little guide for you and some friends as you work your way through Tolkien's The Hobbit. I can't recommend it enough. And now, without further ado, I am absolutely elated to bring you my interview with Corey Olsen. So I'm here with Corey Olsen, the Tolkien Professor. First, I wanted to thank you for coming and joining me, Corey. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you through Signum a little bit. And I'm really glad that you could be here today.
Hey, no, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
We probably want to hear a lot about your reading experience, so I figured we probably just should dive right in.
Sure.
So how were you first introduced to Tolkien's work?
I first was introduced to Tolkien when I was 8 years old. My parents read aloud to me the Chronicles of Narnia when I was 7. And that's always been one of that experience of reading the Chronicles of Narnia for the first time was certainly a very formative moment in my childhood. It's one of the reading experiences I remember most clearly from my childhood. It was the first ever, I say real fantasy work because, of course, much children's literature, including traditional, nursery rhymes and things like that even, have fantasy elements and stuff. But, it was the first time I was ever really immersed in a fantasy world. Fantasy is not something my parents are interested in, really. But they read me the Chronicles of Narnia, and I absolutely loved it. And I have a cousin, technically a first cousin once removed, who had heard that I had read and had heard about my enthusiasm for the Chronicles of Narnia. And so he, for Christmas that year, which was pretty much out of the blue. I mean, I'm very grateful to him because, it's not like he would normally have given me presents, but he gave me a copy of The Hobbit because, and I remember his words. He said, I heard you like the Chronicles of Narnia. And if you like that, you'll really like this too. So he gave me a copy of The Hobbit. He, of course, was very wise and experienced. He was like 14 or something at the time, and I was 8. So, he was like in a completely different zone than I was. So anyway, I was greatly honored, and I read The Hobbit. And the funny thing about, thinking back to my first experience of reading Tolkien is that I literally don't remember exactly when I read The Lord of the Rings. I have the vague memory that I having read The Hobbit, I read and reread The Hobbit immediately. I think I read nothing but The Hobbit for quite some time after I got it. Because another thing to remember or to understand about the context of this, when I was 8 years old, I lived on a mountaintop in West Virginia. And my nearest neighbor was several miles away, and I actually literally had to hike down a mountain to the school bus. So I was quite isolated at that particular point. So my books in my house were, a big center of my reality at that time. We didn't even have a TV at that point in my childhood because we got no reception at all. So anyway, so I outside of school was totally immersed in The Hobbit. I know that I must have gotten a copy of The Lord of the Rings somehow. I think I must have, because I'm quite sure the end of my edition, that edition of The Hobbit that I was given, had like, if you enjoyed this, you should read The Lord of the Rings at the end of it. And so I am sure that I somehow badgered my parents into acquiring it for me, either at a library or at a bookstore. I think at a bookstore before too long, by the next holiday for sure. But when I say I don't really remember reading it for the first time, in part it's because my first reading was followed so rapidly by my second and my third and my fourth readings that it all kind of blurs, you know. So there are many things in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit that I remember, you know, like my early, the class of my early reactions to, like what I used to think about these passages, or what I used to think about these characters, or something like that during that part of my life. But like my actual, you know, I have very few sort of like flashbulb memories of like reading any of those passages for the first time, because again, it was all kind of a blur. All I remember is like definitely considering myself an expert, as one does when one is that age, you know, in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. By the time, like easily by fifth grade, I felt myself to be an expert in that. So anyway, that's how I first came across Tolkien. And from those first times, I mean, I've always been a very enthusiastic rereader of everything that I liked. You know, my in some ways you could say that my reading experience has been this like continually expanding cycle of rereading, you know, going back. I mean, there was a time, middle school and high school, you know, when I had a pretty small set of books that I considered like worthy of rereading, and that I would be like going through and reading and rereading fairly regularly. And of course, adding slowly to that set over time. And you know, you can almost say in a sense that's still where I am. It's just my set is very much larger. So, you know, I will only reread books occasionally. But I mean, like even now, like I'm currently rereading the collected works of C.S. Lewis, because I'm like, man, it's been like 3 or 4 years since I've read the collected works of C.S. Lewis. I need to do that again. So that's always been my thing. So the rereading of Tolkien on a very regular basis. I've reread The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit at least once a year since then.
Yeah, it's funny that you mention feeling like an expert when you're in fifth grade, because that's kind of how I was. I don't remember my first reading of The Hobbit. My first memory of Tolkien at all is my elementary school had a storyteller come and recite chapters of The Hobbit in installments.
Ooh.
And I must have read it before then, because I remember sitting there and listening to make sure that he didn't mess anything up, because I knew the story so well at that point.
Oh, I would have so been there. I would have so been there. I remember once in high school, I must have been my senior year, because I was in calculus class, but the walls of my high school were quite thin, and there was an English class, like a lower level English class. Through the wall, I could hear the teacher, and he was teaching The Hobbit. And I was like paying no attention in calculus, because I was just like listening, and I was exclusively listening to see if he screwed anything up and saying anything about The Hobbit. But the reason I remember being an expert specifically then is that my sister, who is a year ahead of me, was assigned to read it for English class, and I never did. I was never ever assigned to read. She got The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring. She got The Fellowship of the Ring in 7th grade. No, 8th grade, her 8th grade, and The Hobbit in 6th grade. I never got either one of them. Like none of my teachers ever assigned Tolkien, which was probably just as well in the circumstances. So I would have been absolutely insufferable. But yeah, like my sister, of course, took full advantage of the situation and like didn't even read it herself, because she knew that all she had to do is wind me up and get me going, and I would give her all the answers that she wanted. So for her homework assignments. so that's why I attached that particular time to my expertise and my boasting about my expertise, because of my sister's experience.
So, because you started talking about a different reading experience, I'm going to go a little bit out of order with our questions
Okay.
and follow with which reading, or I guess which experience of Tolkien in general has been your favorite so far?
Well, I think my favorite experience was, I think my very, if I had to go back and pick one favorite moment, it would be the moment when I first thought of teaching a Tolkien class. And this is a story that's, I mean, in some ways actually kind of embarrassing to tell. In some ways it's a testimony in part to the, kind of where academia has been, the literary world, has been in relationship to Tolkien through most of the 20th century. Well, I mean, at least, the part that included Tolkien's works. But so, I never ceased being an enthusiastic reader of Tolkien throughout my college years. I was like hanging out in dining halls and like, doing quizzes with several of the other diehard Tolkien fans that I knew, at college and everything. I mean, like I was a geek and considered myself a Tolkien geek all through that time. But of course, the other thing that was happening to me at college was falling in love with medieval literature, which I was reading and studying. And, and I decided that I definitely want to go to graduate school and get my PhD and become a teacher. That was, a decision that I made going into my junior year of college, that that this is what I really, really wanted to do. But here's the embarrassing part. The embarrassing part was that it's not even that I like decided it wasn't worth it or whatever. It literally never occurred to me to connect these two things. Like being a Tolkien geek was like the thing that I was. It was the thing that I did. And I never even thought, it literally not once crossed my mind to actually study Tolkien, to combine my academic studies of literature with my love for Tolkien. Like and all the way through graduate school, I did my PhD in medieval literature, and I'm studying Chaucer, and I'm studying Langland, and I'm doing all these other things. I'm studying Renaissance literature as well. I did quite a bit, and carrying on reading, Tolkien constantly throughout graduate school. I remember that while I was doing my PhD studies, which was between 97 and 03, basically, I remember, during the time when audiobooks were starting to become a more widely available thing, but they were still ludicrously expensive to purchase oneself. They were basically just priced for libraries. So the hours I spent in those years traveling around the greater New York City area to different branches of the New York Public Library that had particular audio. But I remember hunting down the Rob Inglis unabridged recording for the first time in those years. I invested a great deal of time in getting my hands on what had been a dream of my life as the audiophile that I am, which is actually to listen to an unabridged audiobook recording of The Lord of the Rings. Oh my goodness. So again, like I have these very clear memories, which make me 100% certain that my Tolkien fandom was not, waning or in any kind of remission, during those years. And yet, at no point during my college or graduate school career did it ever cross my mind to include Tolkien in my graduate studies or in my professional, like my writing or anything else like that. So my favorite moment, this is all coming back now to my fondest experience. I am eventually going to answer your question. And that was the moment when I had been hired as a tenure track professor. And so I was hired as a medievalist, and the department in which I was initially hired was, it was an English department, and the guy I was replacing, so the guy who had retired, whose line I was hired to fill, had been teaching their medieval literature classes, but he wasn't himself by trade a medievalist. He was actually a Victorian lit guy who had, like, years and years before, like 20 years before, due to other personnel oriented circumstances, had to step in and teach the Chaucer class, and had been doing it for the last 25 years. So he had been, there were only two, because he'd been doing it on the side, there were only two medieval literature courses in the course catalog at this school, an intro to medieval literature and a Chaucer course. And they'd been taught by this guy. So the decision to hire me was premised on a departmental decision that they wanted, like the Middle Ages had been seriously, neglected in the department curriculum for years. And so they decided to, when he retired, to replace him with, a real medievalist. And so that was me. So therefore, one of the things that the department chair charged me with when I arrived was developing new courses, expanding the medieval curriculum. And so, I was supposed to be thinking over what are some new courses that I would like to offer, and that was the moment when it finally happened, when, I was like brainstorming, okay, new courses, what can I teach? And of course I had a bunch of ideas. I was fresh out of grad school, and my Arthurian literature course was a total no-brainer. Like, that's going to be really popular, and okay, we'll do that. And then I had the moment, which is what I look back on as absolutely my fondest moment, is that flashbulb moment, which absolutely blew me away. I mean, because it was then, I feel like that, it's a lot like that line in the end of the Return of the King, like, and the magnitude of his own folly was made, as about Sauron. Like, I guess that's me and Sauron, right? Had that same moment, except it was much more pleasant for me than it was for Sauron. But yes, like that moment when I realized, like, holy cow, like, I should teach a Tolkien class. That would be great. Like, I could do that. Like, that could happen. Like that. And that was, and just, I don't even know if I can explain the feeling of that moment. Like that moment when this partition in my brain, which had been there for my whole life, this partition between my private enjoyment of Tolkien, and again, it seems ludicrous and embarrassing in retrospect to even try to get people to understand the absolute impenetrability of that barrier in my head between, somebody who is spending all of his time talking and teaching about books and loving these other books, and having it literally never occur to me that I could also talk and teach about the books that I loved. Like, but anyway, that was like where I had gotten. So the day that partition came down, and I went to my department chair and said, "Can I teach a class on J.R.R. Tolkien?" And he gave his approval. So, I mean, the experience of teaching that class was wonderful. I really enjoyed, of course, my first ever Tolkien class. But it's not even the teaching of the class that I would identify. It's that moment when, and of course, in so many ways, that was, if I had to look back and point to like life-changing moments, the decision to launch the podcast, the decision to start Signum University, and the decision to leave my old tenured job and do Signum full time. I mean, there are lots of really important moments, in my life and in my professional life, but that one, I think, is the biggest one of all. Because really that determined the course of really the rest of my professional life and much of my entire life. That moment when I was able to take this private passion of mine and make it a core part of my work, my life work. And that has been, and I know I've known people who, who have said, like, be really careful about making your hobby your job. Because it might sound like a really great idea from the outside, but I've known people who, like, for instance, a friend of mine I was having this conversation with, and he's an auto mechanic, and he's an auto mechanic because he loves cars. He loves tinkering with cars. He loves, like, it's his hobby, right? But it's also his job. And, you know, he was reflecting on that and saying that, like, he regrets it. Like, basically, he regrets going into being an auto mechanic full time, because now his hobby isn't fun anymore. Now it's like work. And so he feels that it has, like, you know, that he has lost the sort of pure love for this activity that he always had throughout his life, because now it's, you know, a day at the office. And I certainly, I mean, of course, in a lot of ways, I think I'm just lucky because my day job, like teaching Tolkien to people, is I'm going to go out on a limb and say just more fun than being a professional auto mechanic. So, you know, that experience has certainly not, you know, made Tolkien a drudgery for me in any way. But yeah, I mean, that really, you know, that moment, that's the moment that I started to have you know, one of the things that was one of the most important things in my life become the thing that I spent, you know, my professional effort on, you know, and that was definitely a wonderful, huge moment for me.
Your story is so fascinating, and it reminds me so much of a lot of the things I've heard about and experienced in academia around Tolkien in my own experience. And it's kind of funny because I had a similar moment when I decided to do my Tolkien PhD, because, you know, I had heard all along, like, oh, don't go into Tolkien studies. You won't get a job doing that.
Right.
And then I did my master's in early British literature for that reason, and then came out of the master's going, wait, I won't necessarily get a job doing this either.
Right.
So
yeah, exactly.
I was like, might as well focus on what I actually enjoy for the PhD.
Right.
So in terms of your story always coming back to Tolkien, even when you have so much else on your plate, it leads us into the question of, what is your favorite part of Tolkien? What is it that keeps pulling you back?
Oh, well, that's from this vantage point of my life, an increasingly difficult question to answer. Like, specifically, what keeps pulling me back is increasingly difficult to answer. I mean, it's hard to imagine my life without Tolkien, and I don't just mean like how my life would be if I had never read Tolkien. That is utterly impossible for me to imagine, since it's been such a big part of my life from so early on. But yeah, it's like what keeps me reading Tolkien is almost like, you know, like what keeps me married to my wife, you know, like we've been married for 22 years, you know, that's like, you know, I've now been married for half of my life, and I can't imagine my life without that. So, and again, in a lot of ways, it's sort of the same thing with Tolkien. But my favorite parts of Tolkien, I mean, there's so many things that I love about Tolkien, and there are so many things that I enjoy. And certainly, though I've been teaching Tolkien a lot, and I now spend every week, well, when the Mythgard Academy is doing a Tolkien book, which we're not right now, but we're doing about half the time. When my Mythgard Academy series is doing a Tolkien work, I spend about 8-ish hours a week in live broadcast talking and teaching about Tolkien. 8 to 9 every week. And so, I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to people about Tolkien, and it never gets old. I never run out of material. You know, there are, of course, some questions I've answered many times, and many discussions that come up that I've had many times. But I mean, I'm a teacher. I that never bothers me. You know, I've never been into novelty too much as a concept. And again, rereader, right? Happy with the same set of books and reread them all the time. So I'm also equally happy to have the same conversation many times with many different people, because it's different. The people are different, and the circumstances are different, and their questions are different and oriented differently. And it's always, you know, having having the same conversation with different people is always different. Anyway, so it certainly never paled. I never have felt like I've run out of stuff. But as for my favorite, like my personal favorite things, so Sam has always been my favorite. Okay, hang on a second. I got to be careful, Luke, when I'm talking to you, saying it's always been my favorite character, because I'm trying to remember. When I was 8, was that true? For as long as I remember clearly, Sam has been my favorite character. I always, and in part, it's because I have always been a root for the underdog kind of personality. So it's not that I did not admire very greatly Aragorn and Gandalf and Frodo and even Bilbo, but I always liked Sam because I felt very early on that he was the real hero, that he was, that what he did was important and underappreciated, within the book, even underappreciated. I felt. So I certainly remember having discussions about that when I was in high school. Did I feel that same way when in my middle school years? I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that I did. I have always loved, and it's so rich. It's so complex. Sam's relationship with Hope has always been very moving to me. There's of course the wonderful and famous scene, both the conversation on the stairs of Cirith Ungol and the glimpse of the star after. Those of course are two passages which have always been among my favorites. But I think of all the conversations that Sam has with himself on the road across Mordor, when sort of Frodo's too out of it. Those have been always very, very meaningful to me. Those have been, when I think about parts of Tolkien's work that I come back to when in application in my own life, I have often, in difficult times, remembered, Sam on the road to Mount Doom, and really sort of taken strength from that. And that's again, that's true of, I've had that kind of relationship with Sam more than with any other character in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. There, of course, I could talk for a long time about just other things that I love and other elements that I love about Tolkien's work and that inspire me. The non-Hobbit and Lord of the Rings work that I love most and has been most meaningful to me is Leaf by Niggle, the short story. And that's one which has, I'm a Christian, and the faith elements of that story have always been very, I'm trying, I can't quite remember the very first time I read Leaf by Niggle, but I think it was fairly late. I think I was in graduate school when I read that for the first time. Because again, see, one of the corollaries of my being an avid rereader is that my level of curiosity to find new books has never been my leading characteristic. I'm not one of those person who just I will find and devour everything I can find. That was never me. If I loved a book, I didn't set out to read everything else by that author. I would go back and reread it, So I didn't even find I didn't even know the Silmarillion existed until I was 14. And then I was quite disappointed because I wanted more Lord of the Rings. So a lot of Tolkien's minor works I never really read or found until I was either in high school or in college. And Leaf by Niggle, yeah, I think it was comparatively late that I found that one. there is, I have always found and still believe so much wisdom in Leaf by Niggle, in what Niggle. I mean, it's been a very important work for me in thinking about things like vision and calling and purpose of your life and effect of your life and things like that. So yeah, I just like sort of privately what has really mattered a lot to me. Leaf by Niggle has been really important. Seeing what Niggle learns and how it's. I mean, as you probably know, I have been very resistant to. I think I have been as resistant as Tolkien could possibly have asked to like the autobiographical elements, to like trying to think through Tolkien's own psychology and his own autobiography in response to his works. And I think I'm near the end of the resistant end of the spectrum in doing that. But of course, Leaf by Niggle is one of those works that you just can't. I mean, the places where the works of Tolkien where I'm always thinking about Tolkien himself, Tolkien, the author, Tolkien's own personal experience, where I just can't separate that from the work that he's writing, is Leaf by Niggle, The Lost Road, the abortive early novel, and the Notion Club Papers, the abortive slightly later novel. In those three, again, like it feels very much. I cannot avoid the feeling and the conclusion that Tolkien is really speaking to his own experience and of his own, perceptions of the world and things in different ways. And so again, it's been because from the first time I read Leaf by Niggle, I could feel that, I've never been able to escape that conclusion, and therefore, again, the ways in which that really has inspired me at many points. Niggle's frustrations, prior to his journey with fulfilling his, what he felt to be his, so like he has this vision, right? He feels this sort of calling to do this thing, his feelings of awkwardness and neglect of other things and dissatisfaction with the work he's able to do on his painting, to then his experience when he finds his tree, right, and sees it, and the really remarkable sort of things that story then says about our work, like the interrelationship between the work that we do and the work that God does and all those things. Anyway, it's been something that has meant a lot to me in like a lot of life decisions that I have made.
Yeah, it sounds like the stories that you gravitate towards might have shifted a little bit over time, but the author has stayed the same in a lot of ways.
Yeah. It's I mean, a lot of the shift, of course, has to do with my own changing circumstances and perspectives and things. But yeah, I mean, there's never been a time in my life when, Tolkien wasn't speaking to it, because, there, and a part of this, I think, has to do with the fact that it's not just like it's one book, right? Like there was this one book written by a guy at one point, and that book is so amazing that it speaks to every part of my life. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't or can't be books like that, but that's not Tolkien, right? I mean, Tolkien's stuff, he was in relationship with the stuff that he was writing throughout the course of his life, so, and you can, even, when you're not reading the history of Middle-earth and watching that unfold in different ways, even in the context of the Lord of the Rings itself, you can feel it, right? Because, the way in which all of the things, I mean, there are ways in which I think you can still, like, the things that the things that he felt and experienced in writing the Book of Lost Tales, the way that his stories changed and developed over time, all of that stuff. And I think in a lot of ways gets is still sort of there, still informing the Lord of the Rings in a lot of ways. And so yeah, I mean, his works are really the, and I say his works, not just the Lord of the Rings, but like, the Silmarillion and all these other things, really are the expression of, a life spent, living a quiet and normal life. It's, the expression of a life of, marriage and fatherhood, of scholarship and reading and friendship and so many other things. That again, yeah, I've certainly continuously found much fruitful reading at every stage of my life in Tolkien.
I want to ask you a little bit of a more specific question. Because you've been reading so often throughout your life, I wonder, how has your approach to Tolkien changed now that you are actually teaching Tolkien week in and week out? How is it different from your reading before you taught Tolkien so consistently?
Well, one of the ways that my teaching Tolkien has changed the way that I read is that I guess there are two things. One is the sort of a smaller way and a bigger way. The smaller way is that so when I was reading, I mean, I've always been, good at English class, and I've always really enjoyed, I've always been a careful reader. It's not like I've never been one who reads, just kind of like quickly and superficially. I've always, really enjoyed thinking and talking about books, as well as enjoying reading them. But one change that being a teacher has had is that I find myself, especially with the kind of teaching that I do, that is like answering every question everybody can think of about Tolkien, is I spend a lot of times consciously kind of filling in the gaps. So when I'm rereading, right, I'm not only just like, oh yeah, like this is, I've been looking forward to experiencing this passage again because this is one of my favorites. I mean, I still kind of do that, but I find myself, on purpose paying attention to the things that I like don't usually pay attention to, just like to make sure that it's like, familiarizing myself with my data. There's very much that kind of element to it, where I'm like, okay, right, in my Lord of the Rings reading this time, I'm going to pay particular attention to like all the references to, Arnor and the Númenórean kingdoms, and then I'm going to read and reread carefully, Appendix A and stuff, just to make sure that I am master of the facts and not messing anything up when I'm talking about this, in the context of my teaching and stuff like that. So there are some times when I'm just like, I'm making sure to, it's more like studying, not quite like studying for a text, for a test, but something like that kind of element to it. So that's one way. And of course, like, as I said, I have loved, trivia and minutiae about Tolkien anyway. So it's not like that radically changes my experience, but that's more of a conscious focus. But that's the smaller way. The bigger way is, and this is again why that moment when, my love of Tolkien became part of my public and teaching life is so important to me. The reason I became a teacher, first and foremost, the reason I became a teacher is that I just love sharing things with people. I mean, if I enjoy something, whether it be an experience I have, or a book that I've read, or a movie that I've watched, or whatever it is, if I can tell someone else about it, I enjoy it 5, 10 times as much as if I just experienced it. It's almost, for me, it's almost like if something happens, just like, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, does it still make a noise, right? If I enjoy an experience and I don't get to tell anybody about it, like, did I even really enjoy it? Like, does it matter? Does it mean anything? Is it worth anything to me? That's kind of how I am. And I loved it's not like, oh, my professional life was a barren wilderness before I made that connection. It totally wasn't. I loved medieval literature. I made the decision. In some ways, I feel like it's almost one nifty side effect of not having ever made that connection in my brain earlier is that I feel like there's a kind of purity of motivation of my earlier desire to teach and be like, I made the decision to be an English professor without making that connection. So, it was, there is no question in my mind, of course, that, I became an English professor just because I wanted to talk about Tolkien for a living, right? That's not what I did. Like, because I know I can prove that's not what I did. And yet again, like, the fact that ever since that moment, now every reading of Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings that I have is now full of moments. I mean, this was always true. Like, every time I've always read Tolkien has been true of moments when I see something for the first time, when I enjoy something new that I've never seen or never really appreciated or but now, ever since I have been teaching Tolkien, it's now like, oh, and I can't wait to like talk to my students about this. I can't wait to, I can't wait to talk to people about this. And again, for me, with who I am and how I tick, that's really been a massively enriching experience in a lot of ways. I didn't have any kind of really good Tolkien community. I had a couple friends in college who were Tolkien fans, but honestly, like, we didn't hang out that much. Like, I wouldn't have been friends with them apart from the fact that I happened to discover that they were Tolkien fans, which made them super important. But like the people who were super important to me, like the people who I did hang out with, the people who were my closest friends, most of them were not Tolkien fans at all. Some of them were sort of minor Tolkien fans, but it wasn't their chief thing. So I've never, and in high school, it was even rarer that I had anyone to talk to about this. So, a lot of my life has been spent in the very private enjoyment of these books. And again, private enjoyment, that's almost an oxymoron in my personal experience. Like, so that for me is the number one impact that teaching Tolkien has had. It has, and it's why, again, it's why I never get tired talking about it. It's why I've been doing this, not only just teaching as it started off with teaching my undergrad Tolkien course once every 2 years, which was an awesome experience all by itself. And of course has, turned into this, through my podcast and then, all my Signum and Mythgard broadcasts now where I'm, my Lotro streaming and all that kind of stuff, where I'm now, discussing Tolkien with, dozens or hundreds of people and with thousands of people listening afterwards, like hours and hours every single week. And it has done nothing but increase my enjoyment and my experience and my satisfaction. So, that's a big, it has only become in that way a bigger part of my life in those ways. And, sometimes, of course, my day job, being president of Signum University, there's a lot of work involved in being president of Signum University and, founding a university and getting it up off the ground and stuff. There's a lot that needs to be done. And there have been times when I have thought and other people have thought like, well, God, maybe you should dial back the weekly broadcasts a little bit. Maybe some of that time needs to be, more wisely allocated in, the other work that you need to do. And I've never done it. And the reason and if you look back over the years that I've been intensely involved with trying to found a university, my broadcast hours per week have only increased over that time. And the reason for that is that's like my lifeline. I mean, had I just been being, and I generally hate this word and don't use it within Signum, being an administrator, a university administrator, if I had been just doing that over the last 8 years, I'd have never lived. I could have never handled that. The time that I spend discussing Tolkien, with the wonderful online community that has formed at Signum and through my podcast and everything, that's what keeps the brain and the spirit alive through everything else. I'm not saying that, my work as an administrator is a deadening thing, but it would have become so, certainly, without that intellectual and spiritual refreshment of teaching Tolkien every week. So, so I've tried to convince everyone who has made that polite suggestion that trust me, it's a net gain.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that I speak for a lot of people when I say that, I'm glad that you didn't cut back, because there's a lot of wonderful interactions out there for us to listen to now.
Yeah, it's and again, partly it's one of the things that I think of, again, I imagine even my grad school self, spending hours and hours on subways, going around New York City and trying to find copies of Rob Inglis's recordings. I would have loved my podcast when I was in high school and college and graduate school. The kinds of discussions that a lot of what I do is just the kind of things I always would have wanted to listen to myself. The kinds of I'm having with others the discussions I never had the opportunities to have earlier on, and that's been one of the things that's driven the podcast from the beginning.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. But remember what I said at the beginning. This is only part 1 of a 2-part special with Corey Olsen. So make sure to listen to our next episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast coming out in 2 weeks. We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
So much fun. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest that they mentioned in this interview, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favourite social media sites.
That's right. We're on Facebook as Tolkien Experience, and also on Twitter as @TolkienEXP. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking with our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I am @LukeB.Shelton.
You can also look for me on Twitter, where I am @AaronLPalmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.